Hello and welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we're going to be looking at 7.7. I didn't mean to not have that filled out. 7.8 mass atrocities after 1900. And we're going to be looking at various causes and consequences of mass atrocities from the periods of 1900 to the present. So far, we've already looked at a couple of these in the 20th century. One with the Arose genocide down in the German colony in Southwest Africa. We've also looked at the Armenian genocide during World War I. Right, and in your homework last night was looking at specifically the Holocaust. Okay, and so just make sure we understand exactly what we're talking about, just for make sure our verbiage is correct. Atrocity, right? So versus a genocide, right? So a very specific definition when we start talking about a genocide. All right, so one of the following acts, right, committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or a religious group. Right, so killing members of the group, causing serious body harm or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and then forcibly transferring children, right, of a group to another group. Okay, so those are things that would be identified as a genocide. Right, so when we talk about, this particular topic, the United Nations was formed in the aftermath of the Second World War, in part to provide the idea of what the League of Nations was supposed to be about, a place in order to facilitate international discussion, it can be 20th century concert of Europe, but it was also designed with the failures in mind, so it was intended to be a bit more effective. So, you do have a General Assembly and you do have a Security Council. And, when we look at, the United Nations, how is it, and is it successful? Or has it been successful in its design? And I generally almost always have at least one student in class who is a member of our high school's Model UN chapter. So so the easiest thing to do is, how effective are they? How effective is the United Nations using our own knowledge base here as an expert, by being a member of the Model UN? So, most kids have participated in the General Assembly or as a delegate in the General Assembly. A few have served as members of the Security Council. So if you were, if you have been a member of the General Assembly in Model UN, I generally throw out a hypothetical to you. Let's just say, hypothetically speaking, a civil war breaks out in, let's just say, hypothetically, Syria. And let's just say, hypothetically speaking, the Assad regime uses a chemical weapon on his own population. If that were to hypothetically happen, as a delegate in the General Assembly, what could you do in response to that? And kids who have served in the United Nations are generally pretty quick, to point out, that there's not a lot that can be done except for condemnation. They can pass resolutions, and I do like to point out, because kids generally try to poo-poo that fact as being worthless. But I do like to point out the fact that there is something to be said about even the smallest countries in the world, being able to have a voice in the middle of New York City, and kind of media capital of the world. There is something to be said about that, right? That every country has an opportunity to express, its condemnation or its concerns over incidents like that. All right. So, but that said, the General Assembly is, it's very difficult to move a majority if you're dealing with possibly interfering with the sovereign, the borders of a sovereign nation. Okay. So then we go to the Security Council, right? And students who work in the Security Council, who have done the Security Council before, they realize that, that there are some possibilities. There are some things that can be done. So in our hypothetical situation of a chemical weapon being used in Syria, hypothetically, there are things that could be done, like sanctions. There are things that could be done, like you could even, right, kind of the most extreme is you could actually deploy peacekeeping forces, right? The blue helmets. You could do that. However, those students are also very quick to point out that there are limitations. So when I do ask, well, so why didn't we do anything in response to that? The students are very quick to point out one of the very real limitations of the United Nations is that when you talk about in Model UN kids refer to them as the P5, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Any one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council has veto power over any resolution, anything that is being discussed there. So in our hypothetical example, hypothetically, if Russia had a naval base in the Mediterranean, in Syria, then hypothetically Russia would veto any serious, any serious reaction, to that. So, in order to maintain their hypothetical naval base. Okay. All right. So, there are limitations to what the United Nations can do. Just so you know, kind of structurally, so in addition to your 5 permanent members, there are also 10 rotating members in the Security Council, and they serve, I believe, for 2-year terms. Although it's been a very long time since I've taken a guided tour of the UN. It's probably been close to 20 years now. Okay, so, but anyway, if you, let's just move on. So the United Nations, it's created on kind of lofty goals, right? And I don't think anyone would really make a serious argument that the idea of the United Nations isn't a good one. It is, it's not a bad thing to have, a forum for international dialogue to take place in. It's not a bad thing to have, something like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? I mean, I don't think anyone's reading this and saying that they disagree, that these aren't, lofty goals that all human beings who live on planet Earth shouldn't have, and we shouldn't live up to this kind of stuff. We look at Article 4, no human born on earth, right, should be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all of its forms. I don't think anyone's reading that and thinking that they disagree with it, right? But I also don't think anyone's looking at the United Nations and thinking that, they have been effective at curtailing these things or making these become a reality. So that quote from 1999, 27 million slaves existed, the number is, the number has done really nothing but grow since then. And, in the reality, of 2021 right now is, I'm going to guess the number of people who would fall into the category of being in slavery or servitude, I'm going to guess they probably went up in the year 2020 through 2021. While COVID-19 may have been bad in countries like the United States, they have been much, much worse in countries, like Sub-Saharan Africa and East Africa. So there's an old saying out there that when the United States gets the sniffles, Africa gets the flu. I'm going to guess that, conditions are much, much worse. I'm sure I would be very shocked, once this stuff starts getting reported, that we don't start to see kind of horrific consequences of the lockdowns in Western countries. Okay. So yeah. So, and I always kind of like this quote. I think this kind of makes a lot of sense. So we have the former chief of the UNHCR, And of course, she was the chief during the 90s, and the 90s are a very rich time for atrocities and genocides. In class, I would ask you, can you give me an example of a genocide that occurred during the 1990s? If you took AP Human Geo last year, then you probably know about the Rwandan genocide in 1994. If you did not, then, maybe you might be aware of something that happened in the Balkans, right? We've got two very clear examples of genocide in the Balkans. In the early 90s, we have Bosnia and Herzegovina, that's the Slobodan Milosevic example, and then we have Kosovo in 97. But anyway, so this is an interesting kind of way to think about this, right? When you talk about atrocities or genocides, there are no humanitarian solutions to humanitarian problems. Right? What does she mean by that? Right? And as a student who is coming up on potential military service age, when you think about something like the Rwandan genocide, 100 days, 800,000 people killed. The question I would often ask you is, would you be willing, since you're almost military age, would you be willing to go to Rwanda and put yourself into the middle of that genocide in order to stop it? We have not seen in the last 70 years a lot of willingness by countries to send their children into these conflict zones in order to stop the genocide. We have seen a more than willingness to create the refugee camps, to supply those camps, right? But as far as putting ourselves into the middle of those kinds of scenarios, we have not really seen that, on any large scale. A little bit in the Balkans with Kosovo, right? You did see in the Balkans and Kosovo, but that is a very rare example. Okay, right. So, right. Let's kind of go through the or just talk about the Holocaust for a moment. We've already watched we watched a video that dealt with the Holocaust in class. Your homework last night dealt with the Holocaust. And this is something that most of my students have read a book about. Maybe Night, Diary of Anne Frank. It's always good to get that personal experience. The personal account. It makes it very real, right? When you read about it from a personal account. I do want to kind of point out a couple things that there's photographs I've taken over the years. This is looking at rationing for camps based on country of descent, right? And you can see that Jews and Greeks are largely being starved to death intentionally, right? But I do want to just look at the Holocaust maybe from a different angle than what Strayer does, and this is the whole kind of corporate collusion for this, for the Holocaust. And I do like to show this video, and I do have a link for this so you can watch it yourself. So we're not going to watch it in class, but under the debrief and summary, if you scroll up a little bit, the 5 corporations that helped carry out the Holocaust, just click on that link and it'll pop this video up for you. Okay, so I do like to watch this just to kind of show you this, and I also like to point out one thing is. One of the positive things of the kind of fact-checking revolution that has been going on in recent months is when you do have sources out there that are funded in whole or part by the Chinese government or Russian government, it's now being tagged like that. So that's always a good thing, right? And it is kind of always good to point out that the Russian government is never during the Cold War especially, they never hesitate to take anything that's going on around the world and turn it into an opportunity for propaganda. So here we have a Russian government paid story about the Holocaust. Never mind the fact that the Soviet Union undoubtedly massacred Jews as they made their way across Poland in their attempt to liberate on their way to liberate or to conquer Germany. But anyway, just to point that out, right? So there's a bit of limitations to this. That said, the evidence in here is not wrong. The assertion might be a little bold that they're making, and I would probably make an argument that there are a couple pieces of evidence used to support her assertion, or the assertion being made by this piece. But there is I guess there are a couple of pieces of evidence. The Siemens evidence supports the assertion. The Bayer evidence supports the assertion. The IBM evidence does as well, right? So the Hugo Boss evidence, while it's interesting and true, I wouldn't really say that it supports the assertion, in the same with, Ford Motor Company. Right? It's a little loose, right, as far as evidence is concerned. I also have this IBM video on here, and there's a link right there for that one. And I always kind of just like to make sure, like when we watch this in class, and we do watch this in class, I always want to like to make sure students know what IBM is, right? Most students know that it's a computer company. Today IBM is more of a kind of web-based secure platform, like server farms and, providing secure platforms in order for corporations to use. If you take the AP exam, up until this year, I have no idea what it's going to be this year, but I know that for the last few years, when students go in the summertime to check out their AP scores, it's actually an IBM platform that you're logging into and using as your secure site to get your score reports. So I was going to point that out to make sure that students at least know what the company is. And you're going to see some evidence presented that IBM not only that this corporation not only made the Holocaust possible. When you talk about the logistics of moving millions of people, to multiple places, it is a logistical, kind of wonder that it was even possible to happen. So an argument is going to be made in this piece that IBM makes it possible, but not just that they make it possible, that the corporation knew that it was happening. So you're going to see an argument that gets made. You are going to see about this is about the 4-minute mark. You will see a vice president for IBM. Let's see if I can get his title up here. Right, so you do have someone speaking for IBM. Giving an argument against, not that IBM equipment was used, but that IBM knew about it. IBM America knew about it, and then you're going to see kind of a rebuttal to the rebuttal. Making an argument that there was, it is hard to argue that IBM in the United States didn't know about it. And I like to point this out as a way of looking at atrocities. And I like to do so simply because when you talk about the atrocities, they happen. We have conflict zones around the country. We have atrocities taking place. They will continue to take place. If we know that the United Nations has not historically been an effective way of dealing with this, primarily because of the sovereignty issue, there is one group that can work around that, and that is multinational corporations, transnational corporations. They operate without borders, and it is always good to be aware that we are going to get, you are going to have, examples of atrocities taking place. But are the multinational corporations that are operating within these countries, are they doing anything about it, or are they simply ignoring it? And when you kind of look around, obviously, let's just take a modern example. There are a number of rare earth minerals that are required in order to make our electronics that we use today. Are companies around the world not supporting, conflict zones, supporting warlords, supporting things like children being taken away from the family and being forced to work in coltan mines, children being taken away from their family to be soldiers. Are companies trying to do anything about it? Not are companies completely 100% never supporting it, but are they at least making an attempt, or are they simply ignoring it? And, as far as like, how do you stop atrocities? Maybe you're not willing to put yourself into the middle of one of these things, one of these conflict zones, but maybe you're willing to educate yourself on which companies are and are not, supporting these kinds of things, because your consumer dollars are then being used to buy these things, which are then being used to fund this kind of activity. So it is worthwhile. Like, for example, if you are in the market to buy a cell phone, it is worthwhile to ask yourself, right, and do just a little bit of research, about this, right, and look at your options, and try to find out how companies are doing, and what companies are doing to try to eliminate their support of these kinds of things, right? So just a different way of looking at it, all right? All right, I just want to run down through, kind of give you some post-World War II examples, and I guess I want to try to run down through 2 examples for you, just so that you have, because we've already done 2 in the first half of the 20th century, or maybe 3, I guess, if and I want to provide you with a couple of examples of kind of post-World War II examples. So really quickly, right, the Rwandan genocide. So this is a 100-day event, and 800,000 people are going to be slaughtered. One of the primary means of that massacre, or the genocide, was machete, right? And and when you look at what happened and why it happened, this is a situation where we have an ethnic difference that existed and had existed since the 1500s in what is today Rwanda and Burundi. Historically, the Tutsis, they came into this region about 500-600 years ago, or about 500 years ago, and they established themselves as the dominant ethnicity with an aristocratic monarchy. Right, and so and that will be persistent into the beginning part of the 20th century, when the Belgian government will come in and colonize it. The Belgian government will then maintain the status quo, with the Tutsis, but you are going to have some introduction of additional scientific racism in order to strengthen the persistent dominant claims of the Tutsis. Once decolonization happens, you are going to see you're going to see the Hutu. They're going to get very brutally suppressed. There'll be an atrocity take place in neighboring Burundi, and this will cause cause an already existing tension between the 2 ethnic groups to kind of fester. And then in April to July of '94, we're going to see a military campaign by Tutsi exiles to retake Rwanda, from the existing Hutu-dominated government, and then this will then instigate the massacre of the Tutsis, right? The genocide. So there is a spark event that happens here, and then we're going to see during this very kind of tight window, 800,000 Tutsis are going to be killed. And then of course, what happens next is almost as bad as the actual genocide. You're going to see the RPF, the Rwandese Patriotic Front. They will take over Rwanda, and then they're going to create a situation where there's a mass refugee crisis, right? 2 million refugees. And I've got a map here that kind of just shows you where some of these refugee camps were, and just how big they all how big they all were. So the refugee crisis is gonna persist for over a decade after this, and this is where the UN does come in, right? The UN does, a relatively effective job at dealing with humanitarian crises and humanitarian interventions. That they are effective at. The stopping the genocides, not so much. There's a background video that I do like to show in class. It's really quick. It's about 2 minutes long. Right, so let's just watch this real quick. So if the video doesn't sound good, it's only 2 minutes long. Turn this.
A long way down about their road trip through Africa. You might remember them visiting a genocide memorial like this in Rwanda and asking the guide, "Are you Hutu or Tutsi?"
At first, the Hutu and the Tutsis were social clans.
We used to have Tutsis and Hutus. That was not a big issue.
But the idea of Hutu and Tutsi has played such a big part in Rwanda's history. So what does Hutu and Tutsi mean to Rwandan?
Before the colonization, the ruling system here in Rwanda was the kingship. Yeah, there were kings, and all those kings were Tutsis.
The Hutu were people who were farming and farming land, plants, growing crops, and the Tutsi were basically pastoralists, cows, milking, and the Tutsis were considered to be rich because in the Rwandan society, cows are valued as important.
Then in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the Europeans started dividing up Africa among themselves.
During colonization, the colonialists wanted a way of dividing the country.
When the Belgians came, they first established friendship with the Tutsis, now with the Hutus, and it created some kind of jealousy between the Tutsis and the Hutus.
For them, they magnified it and started saying that Hutus were different from Tutsis. The noses, the height. They're saying Tutsis are really tall, while Hutus are very short.
After colonization and then independence, the gap between Hutu and Tutsi grew wider.
Since they had started believing that Tutsis were foreigners, the politicians had this ideology of saying that Tutsis should go back to their countries, that they are not Rwandans, they are just strangers. And so a lot of people were forced to go into exile. Some went to Uganda, Congo. My grandparents went to Burundi. That's where I was born.
Right, and this site here does kind of give you some of the percentages of the populations, right? That are present there. Okay. All right. So go ahead over. All right. So there's a series of documents that I have. Sometimes in class I look at them. Sometimes I use them for SAQ prompts or stuff like that. All right. I also want to give you another example of a genocide that occurs after World War II, second half of the 20th century. And this one is the Khmer Rouge in Pol Pot. Right. So when we talk about the Khmer Rouge and in Pol Pot with Cambodia, this is the former French Indo-Chinese colony, right? And you will see the establishment of a country of Cambodia, following the breakup of French Indochina in 1956 with that treaty in Paris. As far as the Khmer Rouge, most origins of the Khmer Rouge go back to the late 1960s. In the origination of them as going back to the U.S. bombing campaign in Cambodia. So the United States, we bombed Cambodia, not because we were at war with Cambodia, but Cambodia was being used by North Vietnamese troops as a way to go around American and South Vietnamese forces, and infiltrate into South Vietnam. So you'll sometimes hear it referred to as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. That's in Cambodia. Okay, and so it was the way that people and weapons were being going into South Vietnam. So the United States, in response to that, there was a bombing campaign, and then this is often cited as the reason why the Khmer Rouge, which are people from the Khmer, are from the mountains of Cambodia. This is going to result in them organizing, against the current Cambodian regime at this time, and a civil war will break out. Right. So Pol Pot is is a Marxist leader, and he has his own form or own interpretation of peasant agrarian socialism. All right. And so the Khmer Rouge will use the United States actions to recruit followers, and then as an excuse for their policies. So in 1975, they will overrun the government and take over Cambodia. This becomes known as Cambodia Year Zero, and all the city dwellers are going to be forcibly moved to the countryside to become agricultural workers, largely in the rice fields. Right. Money becomes worthless. Civil liberties all come to an end. Religion gets banned. You start seeing this term. Hundreds of thousands of educated middle class are tortured, right, executed, right, in special re-education centers. Many others starve, right, die from disease, exhaustion. Total death toll for the 3-year period is around 1.7 million people. And then eventually they will pick a fight with Vietnam after 4 years after South Vietnam falls, and then that'll begin a decade of trouble for Cambodia and Vietnam, right? But Pol Pot will eventually flee because of that. I'm just going to skip ahead and just show you this. So during this 3 to 4 year time period, we can see what happens to the population. The actions of Pol Pot's re-education campaign results in about 1 in every 5 people, probably a little bit more than 1 in every 5, probably closer to 1 in 4. People in Cambodia will die as a result of those actions. There is a film made about this. It's called The Killing Fields. Based on a book, right, and of somebody who was there. It is definitely a good film, right? A good film to watch, right? So, and there's no shortage of good stimulus out there talking about Cambodia, right, and Pol Pot, right? So yeah, so. Is definitely just pausing and reading through these is good. So there's very good source information that I have on here for this. Okay. All right. So sorry. I'm trying to pause it for at least a couple seconds in case you want to pause it. Like I said, there's a lot of source information. I pull a lot of these off from the New York State Regents Global History Regents site. And so this is obviously a very common question for the New York State Regents. Over the years, they pulled a ton of this topic. One thing to kind of just look at really quick before we go is. When you look at mass atrocities, the total number of dead is kind of a traditional way of looking at this. So when we look at the Holocaust, we say that there's over 6 million Jews that were killed. Over 11 million if you include non-Jewish deaths in the Holocaust. So total number of dead is a very traditional way of looking at it. This case of Cambodia, how I gave it to you, 21% on that source that we had before. This is also a way that historians will often, try to frame a genocide is, when you hear about massive numbers, like Stalin killed 20 million of his own people. The Holocaust was 11 million people killed. It's easy to look at a number like 1.5 to 3 million, as maybe not as big of a deal, until you look at, what your odds of surviving in Cambodia was, at that particular time. So sometimes, you'll see it both ways. So just be aware of that. You'll often see it put this way if they're trying to magnitude the significance of the event, or just trying to make sure that you're aware of the magnitude. So you often see that. So in the case of the Rwandan genocide, you'll often see 800,000 people killed in that 100 days. But that's 13% of the population of Rwanda. That is, as shocking as the number itself is, right? So you'll see it in both ways, right? And I also have up here the United States and the Philippines, right? So the propaganda movement, the Jose Rizal, that movement was already in place in 1898 when the United States takes over for the Spanish, right? When we conquer it, and then you're going to see that that insurgency will flare up, by the spring of 1899. Will run until what 1902. So about 2.8% of the population of the Philippines, right, will die, as part of that insurgency movement against the United States, right? So Bosnia, this is referring to Slobodan Milosevic, right? His regime, right? Indonesia, right? The 1965 massacre of suspected communists, largely targeting people of Chinese descent, right? Largely targeting Chinese descent there. Right. So then the nationalist massacre under Chiang Kai-shek, right? And then of course the Cultural Revolution, right, from 66 to 76. Okay. All right. So that is all for today, and we'll do some skill practice tomorrow. Just a couple key takeaways here. Mass atrocities require cooperation from many interests. Cooperation can be active or passive, right? So, right, and then of course, structures to combat mass atrocities arise after World War II. So we do see some structures put into place. The Nuremberg Trials create this. The United Nations adopts the Declaration of Human Rights. We see the High Commission for Refugees, get established from the United Nations. And then in the beginning part of the 21st century, we see the International Criminal Court established in The Hague, right, in an international tribunal. This was largely created because of the events of the 1990s. Okay, so you do have some structural changes that have been made in response to the atrocities of the 20th century. All right, that is all for today. Sapriati.